I watched Reverend Callum steal from God's house when I was 6 years old. Watched him pocket coins meant for the orphanage where my mother had just died. 20 years later, I returned to Salvation Ridge wearing a Marshal star and carrying a rope with 13 coils. But the town that made him a saint had forgotten how to see devils. Even when they stood behind pulpits preaching mercy, they'd never shown. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The stagecoach rattled into Salvation Ridge on a September morning, so clear you could see your sins reflected in the sky. Marshal Ethan Cross sat rigid in his seat, his badge catching sunlight like a shard of broken promises. 20 years. 2 decades since he'd last seen this town, since he'd stood as a 6-year-old boy watching them lower his mother into hard earth, while Reverend Nathaniel Callum spoke words about God's mercy that tasted like ash even to a child who didn't yet understand betrayal. The town looked smaller than memory painted it. Main Street stretched perhaps 300 yards, flanked by false front buildings that leaned into each other like drunks sharing secrets. The church still dominated the eastern end, white clapboard structure with a bell tower that cast long shadows across the town square, where justice had once been decided by rope and righteous fury. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different, like returning to a childhood home to find it had always been smaller than you remembered. Ethan stepped down from the coach, his boots hitting dust that rose in small clouds, coating the hem of his long black coat. He was 37 now, lean as whipcord, with eyes the color of winter storms and a face weathered by years of chasing outlaws across territories where law was whatever the man with the fastest draw claimed it to be. The Marshal star on his chest was the third he'd worn. The first 2 had been taken from dead men, and Ethan had inherited their duties along with their demons. "Welcome to Salvation Ridge," the stagecoach driver called down, already unloading luggage. "You here for business or salvation?" "Both," Ethan replied, his voice carrying the dry rasp of desert wine through canyon stones. The driver gave him a strange look, but said nothing more. Men who wore badges and spoke in riddles were best left alone in towns that remembered how quickly law could become violence. Ethan stood in the street, letting the town wash over him. The saloon, the Golden Promise, still stood across from the church, a deliberate insult or maybe a commentary on human nature. The general store, the livery stable, the assayer's office, all exactly where memory placed them. But what caught his attention was the new building beside the church, freshly painted with a sign that read, Salvation Ridge Orphanage, founded by Reverend Callum, 1885. 20 years ago, that building didn't exist. 20 years ago, the church had collected donations to build an orphanage, had passed collection plates every Sunday, had gathered nearly $3,000 from families who could barely afford to feed themselves, but believed in charity, believed in helping children like Ethan who had nowhere else to go. But the orphanage was never built. The money vanished, and Reverend Callum had stood in his pulpit explaining that God's plans were mysterious, that the funds had been stolen by drifters, that they would try again next year. Except there was no next year. The orphans, Ethan among them, were distributed to families who took them in as unpaid labor, mouths to feed in exchange for work that broke young backs. Ethan had been sent to the Morrison Ranch, where he'd spent his youth learning that survival meant becoming harder than the land that tried to kill you. But before he'd left town, before the Morrison wagon carried him away from everything he'd known, Ethan had crept into the church late one night. He'd hidden in the shadows beneath the pews, waiting, watching, and he'd seen Reverend Callum enter through the side door, moving to the office where donations were kept. Seen him open the strongbox with a key that hung around his neck. Seen him count bills and coins with the practiced movements of a man who'd done this many times before. And then, most damning of all, seen him fill a leather satchel with the money meant for orphans and walk out into the night. A 6-year-old boy's testimony was worthless in Salvation Ridge. Ethan had tried to tell the marshal, a man named Garrett Stone, now long dead, But Stone had dismissed it as a grieving child's imagination, had told Ethan that accusing a man of God was a sin that would follow him to hell. So Ethan had learned to keep his mouth shut, to bury the memory deep, and to wait for the day when his testimony might carry weight. That day had come. Marshal Ethan Cross walked toward the church, his hand resting on the peacemaker revolver holstered at his hip. The weapon was a tool, nothing more. He learned long ago that violence solved some problems, but created others. Still, there was comfort in cold steel, in knowing that when words failed, other options existed. The church doors were open, welcoming. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old wood and candle wax. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, painting the pews in shades of red and gold. At the far end, before the altar, Reverend Callum stood arranging flowers, his back to the entrance. He was older now, 60 if Ethan remembered correctly. His hair gone white, his frame slightly stooped, but he moved with the confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences, who believed himself untouchable. "Reverend Callum," Ethan called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. The Reverend turned, a smile forming on his lips, the professional expression of a man accustomed to greeting parishioners with warmth, whether he felt it or not. But the smile faltered when he saw the badge, when his eyes traveled up to Ethan's face and found something there that made recognition flicker and die. "Marshal," Callum said carefully, setting down the flowers, "how can the church serve you today?" "By answering questions about theft, fraud, and the death of children who deserve better." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Callum's face paled, his hands gripping the altar rail, as if it might anchor him against the storm he saw approaching. "I don't understand," he stammered. "What theft? What children?" Ethan stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Each step measured, deliberate, the approach of judgment long delayed. $3,000, collected in 1872 to build an orphanage. The money disappeared. You claimed it was stolen by drifters. But I saw you take it, Reverend. I was 6 years old, hiding under the pews, watching you fill a satchel with coins meant to save children like me. And I've spent 20 years becoming the man who could make you answer for it." Callum's expression cycled through denial, fear, calculation, and finally settled on indignation, the refuge of men caught in lies they'd told so long they'd become truth. "You were a child," he said, his voice gaining strength. "A grieving, traumatized child whose mother had just died. Your memory is corrupted by loss and time. I've served this community for 40 years. I built that orphanage with my own hands and my own funds when the collected donations were indeed stolen. So if I examine the church records from 1872, Ethan replied calmly, "I'll find documentation of your personal investment, receipts, bank transfers." Callum hesitated a fraction too long. "Of course, though records from that long ago can be incomplete." "Then let's examine what's complete," Ethan interrupted. He pulled a folded document from his coat. "This is a territorial bank ledger from 1872. It shows a deposit of $2,800 into an account under the name Nathaniel C. Thompson. The deposit date matches exactly 1 week after the church donations went missing." He let that sink in, watching Callum's face. "Thompson was your mother's maiden name, Reverend. You thought using it would hide the trail." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of the church bell swaying slightly in the wind, its clapper tapping gentle as a heartbeat against brass. Callum aged before Ethan's eyes, the mask of righteousness crumbling to reveal the frightened, grasping man beneath. "You can't prove anything," Callum whispered. "That money, even if it existed, is long spent. And who will believe a lawman with a grudge over a man who's baptized 3 generations?" "Oh, the town will believe what it wants to believe," Ethan agreed. "That's human nature. But I'm not here for the town's belief. I'm here because 12 children died in the years after that money was stolen. Died in accidents on ranches. Died from illnesses that proper shelter would have prevented. Died because the orphanage that should have protected them was never built." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to something cold and final. "Their blood is on your hands, Reverend. And so is my mother's. She died believing God would provide for me. believing the church would honor its promises. Callum straightened, some desperate defiance returning. Then arrest me, Marshal. Drag me before a judge. Let the law decide. But you know how this ends. My word against yours. My reputation against your vendetta. I'll walk free, and you'll be the lawman who tried to destroy a pillar of the community. Ethan smiled, and it was not a kind expression. Who said anything about arrest? News traveled fast in small towns, carried on tongues eager for scandal and ears hungry for drama. By sunset, half of Salvation Ridge knew that a federal marshal had confronted Reverend Callum in the church, had made accusations about theft and dead children, and that the Reverend had emerged shaken but defiant, calling an emergency town meeting to address what he termed slanderous attacks from a disturbed individual with a personal vendetta. Ethan watched from the window of his hotel room as townspeople gathered in the square, their faces lit by torches and oil lamps that turned the scene into something biblical, like a painting of Judgment Day where no one could agree who was being judged. He recognized some faces, older versions of people he'd known as a child. Martha Henley, who ran the boarding house and had given young Ethan bread when he was hungry. Samuel Braddock, the blacksmith whose daughter had been one of the 12 orphans who died. Dozens of others, all of them gathering to defend a man who'd stolen their charity and spent it on his own comfort. The knock on his door was soft but insistent. Ethan opened it to find a woman in her 50s, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her dress plain but clean. Her face was weathered by sun and time, but her eyes held something sharp and assessing. "I'm Catherine Morrison," she said without preamble. "You probably don't remember me." "I remember," Ethan interrupted gently. "You took me in after my mother died. Fed me, clothed me, taught me to read from your family Bible." Catherine nodded stiffly. "My husband James worked you like a mule and never let me forget that charity had limits. When you ran away at 14, I was relieved. Relieved you'd escaped before this place, killed whatever goodness you had left. Why are you here, Mrs. Morrison?" "Because I saw it too," she whispered, glancing down the hallway as if afraid of being overheard. "Not the theft. I wasn't there for that. But I saw what happened to those children after the orphanage money disappeared. Saw them parceled out to families who treated them as property. Saw them die from neglect, from abuse, from sheer exhaustion." She met his eyes, and he saw grief there, old and deep. "My own conscience isn't clean, Marshal. I could have fought harder to protect you, to protect them. I chose my marriage and my comfort over doing what was right." The confession hung between them, honest and raw. "That's why you're here now," Ethan said. "To make amends." "Is it possible to make amends for dead children?" Catherine asked bitterly. "But yes, if you're planning what I think you're planning, you'll need allies. The town won't turn on Callum easily. He's performed their weddings, baptized their babies, buried their dead. He's woven himself into their lives so completely that attacking him feels like attacking themselves. Then how do I make them see?" Ethan asked, frustration bleeding into his voice. "You show them what he built with stolen money," Catherine replied. "The orphanage he claims to have funded himself. I kept records. I was the church treasurer from 1870 to 1875, before Callum convinced the council that the position should be held by a man. I documented every donation, every expense. And when the orphanage money disappeared, I documented that too." She pulled a worn ledger from her bag, its leather cover cracked with age. "This shows the collections, the amounts, the dates. And this," she flipped to a marked page, "shows that no personal funds from Callum were ever recorded for the orphanage construction. He built it 10 years later using church money again, calling it his personal project to deflect suspicion." "Why didn't you come forward before?" "Because I was a woman in a town that valued women's silence over their truth," Catherine said sharply. "Because my husband threatened to leave me destitute if I caused trouble. Because I was a coward, Marshal. But I'm old now, and my husband is dead, and I'm tired of watching a thief wear the robes of righteousness." Ethan took the ledger, feeling its weight, not just physical but moral. "This is evidence. Real documented evidence. We can bring charges, force an investigation." Catherine shook her head. "You can try. But Callum has spent decades building relationships with territorial officials, with judges, with men who owe him favors. He's protected, Marshal. The law you represent is an ideal, but law in practice bends toward power and influence. You know that as well as I do. She was right, and the truth of it burned. Ethan had seen it too many times. Outlaws walking free because they knew the right people. Victims denied justice because the powerful protected their own. Then what do you suggest? He asked. Public revelation, Catherine replied. At the town meeting tonight. Force Callum to defend himself not in a courtroom where he controls the narrative, but in front of the people he's deceived. Let them see the ledgers, hear the testimony, make their own judgment. And if they choose to protect him anyway, then at least you'll have given them the truth, Catherine said. What they do with it is their burden to carry, not yours. The town meeting was held in the church, because where else would they hold a trial of faith? Ethan entered to find every pew packed, standing room only, the air thick with body heat and tension. Reverend Callum stood at the pulpit, his white hair catching lamplight like a halo, his expression sorrowful but strong, the face of a man wounded by injustice, but determined to endure. Brothers and sisters, Callum began, his voice rich and warm, practiced from decades of sermons. We gather tonight under unfortunate circumstances. A man has come to our town, wearing a badge and carrying accusations, seeking to destroy a lifetime of service with lies and half-truths. He's playing on tragedy, on the losses we've all suffered, to advance a personal vendetta. Ethan stood at the back, letting Callum speak. Give him enough rope, an old mentor had once said, and most men will hang themselves. Marshal Cross claims that I stole money meant for an orphanage. Callum continued, that I used church funds for personal gain. These are serious accusations, and they deserve serious answers. So let me be clear. I have dedicated my life to this community. Every dollar that passed through my hands went to God's work. The orphanage that stands beside this church, I built that with my own savings, with my own labor, because I believed, still believe, that we have a duty to care for the least among us. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Ethan waited, letting the Reverend dig deeper. But this Marshal, Callum said, his voice taking on an edge, isn't interested in truth. He's interested in revenge. You see, Marshal Cross was one of the orphans we helped all those years ago. His mother died, God rest her soul, and we found him a home with the Morrisons. But young Ethan was troubled, angry, prone to fantasies. He ran away at 14, and we lost track of him. Now he returns, wearing a badge and carrying grudges, seeing villainy where there is only human imperfection. The crowd was nodding now, their expressions sympathetic toward Callum, suspicious toward Ethan. This was the danger. Callum had spent decades building trust, weaving himself into the fabric of Salvation Ridge. Unwinding that would take more than accusations. May I speak? Ethan called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Callum spread his hands magnanimously. Of course, Marshal. I've nothing to hide. Ethan walked down the center aisle, every eye following him. He reached the pulpit, standing beside Callum, and turned to face the congregation. You all remember 1872, he began, the year the church raised funds to build an orphanage. You gave what you could. Some of you gave what you couldn't afford, because you believed in helping children who had no one else. Heads nodded. They remembered. That money disappeared, Ethan continued. Reverend Callum told you it was stolen by drifters. Told you that God's work would continue despite this setback. And you believed him, because why wouldn't you? He was your spiritual leader, your guide. But the money wasn't stolen by drifters. He pulled out Catherine's ledger. This is the church treasury record from 1870 to 1875, maintained by Mrs. Catherine Morrison. It shows $3,042 collected for the orphanage, and it shows that money vanishing with no documentation of theft, no marshal's report, no investigation. That proves nothing, Callum interrupted. Records can be falsified, memories corrupted. And this? Ethan produced the bank ledger. A deposit of $2,800 into an account under Nathaniel C. Thompson, your mother's maiden name, Reverend, 1 week after the church funds disappeared. Coincidence? The crowd stirred, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. Maybe, Ethan conceded. So let's talk about what happened after. He turned to face them fully now, his voice carrying the weight of grief long buried. 12 children died in the 3 years following that theft. 12 orphans who were placed with families that worked them too hard, fed them too little, cared for them not at all. I have their names. He pulled out another document, beginning to read. Thomas Fletcher, age 7, died from a fall while repairing a barn roof alone. Margaret Kinsey, age 9, died from pneumonia after sleeping in an unheated shed. James Worthy, age 6. Stop this, Callum demanded, his composure cracking. You're weaponizing tragedy. Ethan continued reading, his voice steady, relentless. Sarah Blackwood, age 8, died from injuries sustained when a horse she was too small to handle kicked her. Peter Chen, you've made your point. Someone shouted from the crowd. Ethan looked up. Have I? Because I can keep going. I have 12 names here. 12 children who died because the orphanage that should have protected them was never built. And I can show you bank records proving that Reverend Callum used that stolen money to purchase property in Silver City, to invest in mining stocks, to fund a lifestyle that far exceeded his church salary. He let that land, watching faces shift from certainty to doubt. That's when Samuel Braddock stood up, his blacksmith's frame making him impossible to ignore. My daughter Rebecca was one of those 12, he said, his voice rough with old pain. She was 10 years old, Marshal. Smart as a whip, sweet as summer honey. The family that took her worked her in their fields from sunup to sundown. When she got sick, they didn't call for a doctor. Said it would cost too much for an orphan. She died in a dirt floor shack, alone except for the rats. Tears streaked his weathered face. I've spent 18 years telling myself it was God's will, that some children are just unlucky. But if what you're saying is true, Marshal, if the orphanage money was stolen, then my daughter didn't die from bad luck. She died because a man of God chose his greed over her life. The church was silent except for Braddock's ragged breathing. Then Catherine Morrison stood. I kept those records, she said clearly. Every word the Marshal speaks is documented. I was too afraid to come forward back then, afraid of what it would cost me. But I won't be silent anymore. She looked at Callum. You stole from this community, Nathaniel. You stole from God. And you let children die to cover your sin. The crowd erupted, some shouting support for Catherine and Ethan, others defending Callum. Accusations and counter-accusations flying like bullets in a firefight. Through it all, Reverend Callum stood at the pulpit, his face ashen, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him like walls with rotten timbers finally giving way to weight they could no longer bear. The morning after the town meeting, Salvation Ridge woke to a silence more oppressive than any storm. People moved through their routines with mechanical precision, avoiding eye contact, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. The church bell didn't ring for morning prayers. Reverend Callum had barricaded himself in the rectory, refusing to emerge, refusing to face the accusations that now hung over him like a noose waiting to drop. Ethan sat in the hotel dining room, nursing coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, watching through the window as the town wrestled with its conscience. Catherine Morrison had left the ledgers with him, physical proof of Callum's theft, but proof meant nothing without the will to act on it. And Salvation Ridge, like so many small towns built on fragile bonds of trust and shared illusion, was struggling to choose between truth and comfort. The door opened, admitting Samuel Braddock. The blacksmith looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight, his eyes red-rimmed from tears or sleeplessness or both. He crossed to Ethan's table without asking permission and sat heavily, his massive frame making the chair creak. I've been thinking about Rebecca all night, Braddock said, his voice rough as gravel. Thinking about the day we placed her with the Hendersons. They seemed decent enough, had a farm, needed help, promised they'd treat her well. I told myself it was God's plan, that orphans had to make do, that we'd done our best. He looked at Ethan with eyes full of anguish. But we didn't do our best, did we? We gave money to build a home for those children, and when that money disappeared, we just accepted it, moved on, found other solutions, and children died because of our acceptance. "It's not your fault," Ethan said, though the words felt inadequate. "Isn't it?" Braddock's fist slammed against the table, rattling the coffee cup. "I trusted Callum because it was easier than questioning him. I gave my daughter to strangers because it was convenient. I've spent 18 years praying for forgiveness, but I never once demanded accountability from the man who stole the money that could have saved her. That's cowardice, Marshal, and I'm done with it." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to talk to the others, the other families who lost children. We're going to force a reckoning. Callum thinks he can hide behind his collar and his reputation, but he's wrong. This ends today." Braddock left, and Ethan felt something shift in the air, like the pressure change before a thunderstorm. The town was waking up, shaking off the numbness, and anger was beginning to replace shock. By noon, a crowd had gathered outside the church, not the organized assembly of the town meeting, but something more primal, more dangerous. 30 or 40 people, many of them parents or relatives of the 12 dead orphans, holding tools that could easily become weapons. Their voices rose in a discordant chorus of rage and grief, demanding that Callum come out, that he face them, that he answer for his sins. Ethan pushed through the crowd to find Braddock at the front, hammering on the church doors with a sledgehammer-sized fist. "Callum, come out here, you coward. You stole from us. You killed our children." The doors remained closed. Ethan grabbed Braddock's arm. "This isn't the way. We have evidence. We can bring formal charges." "Formal charges?" A woman's voice, sharp and bitter. Ethan turned to see Margaret Kinsey's aunt, a weathered woman in her 60s named Ruth. "Formal charges take months, maybe years. They require judges who can be bought and lawyers who twist the truth. How many times have we seen guilty men walk free because they knew the right people, paid the right bribes?" "She's right," another man called out. "Callum has connections in the territorial government. He'll make this disappear, just like he made the orphanage money disappear." The crowd murmured agreement, their mood darkening, shifting from righteous anger towards something uglier. Ethan recognized the signs. He'd seen it before in other towns. The moment when people stopped believing in institutions and started believing in rope. "Listen to me," Ethan said, raising his voice to carry over the crowd. "I understand your anger. I share it. But if we descend into mob justice, we become no better than the man we're accusing. Let the law handle this." "The law?" Ruth Kinsey spat. "The law you represent. The same law that told a 6-year-old boy his testimony didn't matter because he was accusing a man of God. Forgive me, Marshal, but your law has failed us before." The truth of that statement hit Ethan like a physical blow. She was right. The law had failed him, had failed the orphans, had failed this entire town. And now he was asking them to trust the same system that had enabled Callum's crimes. Before he could respond, the rectory door opened a crack, and a rifle barrel emerged, followed by Reverend Callum's voice, trembling but defiant. "Stay back, all of you. I'm within my rights to defend my property against a mob." "Your property?" Braddock roared. "Property you bought with stolen money, with blood money." "Lies," Callum shouted back. "Lies from bitter people who need someone to blame for tragedies that were nobody's fault. I've given my life to this community, and this is how you repay me. You gave us sermons and empty promises." Ruth Kinsey yelled, "While our children died in ditches and work sheds. Come out here and face us, Nathaniel." The rifle fired, not at anyone, but into the air, a warning shot that sent the crowd stumbling back. In the chaos, Ethan saw his moment. He pulled his peacemaker and fired twice, the bullets striking the church doors inches from the barrel of Callum's rifle. The Reverend jerked back inside, slamming the door shut. "Everybody stop," Ethan commanded, his voice cutting through the panic. The crowd froze, looking at him with expressions that mixed fear, anger, and desperate hope. "Callum, if you fire that rifle at these people, I will arrest you for attempted murder. And to the rest of you, if you break into that church, you'll be guilty of assault, possibly murder if someone dies in the fighting. Is that what you want? To give him a legal defense?" The crowd hesitated, the momentum broken. Ethan pressed his advantage. There's a territorial marshal arriving tomorrow on the noon stage. I sent word to him 3 days ago. He'll have the authority to formally investigate, to bring charges that will stand up in any court. 24 hours. That's all I'm asking. Give the law one more chance to work. And if it doesn't? Braddock asked quietly. Ethan met his eyes. Then I won't stand in your way. The promise hung in the air, dangerous and electric. Slowly, grudgingly, the crowd began to disperse. Their anger banked, but not extinguished. They would wait 24 hours, but no longer. As Ethan walked back toward the hotel, Catherine Morrison fell into step beside him. "There's no territorial marshal coming, is there?" she asked. "No," Ethan admitted. "But I'm hoping Callum doesn't know that. And I'm hoping that by tomorrow, I'll have convinced enough people in this town that formal justice is worth pursuing." "And if you can't?" Ethan looked back at the church, at the building that should have been a sanctuary but had become a symbol of betrayal. Then maybe frontier justice is all that's left. Night fell over Salvation Ridge like a burial shroud, thick and suffocating. Ethan couldn't sleep, so he walked the empty streets, his footsteps echoing off false front buildings that seemed to lean inward like conspirators sharing secrets. The town felt different in darkness, smaller, meaner, as if the night stripped away the veneer of civilization to reveal the raw bones of survival beneath. He found himself standing outside the church again, drawn by something he couldn't name. The building was dark except for a single lamp burning in the rectory window, a weak yellow glow that barely pushed back the shadows. Callum was awake too, probably wrestling with demons of his own making. Ethan tried the church door and found it unlocked. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old wood and candle wax. He walked down the center aisle, his boots echoing in the empty space, until he stood before the altar where Callum had preached about mercy and forgiveness and God's love. The hypocrisy of it burned in Ethan's chest like swallowed fire. "I knew you'd come." Ethan spun, his hand dropping to his revolver, to find Reverend Callum emerging from the shadows near the pulpit. The old man looked haggard, his white hair disheveled, his clothes rumpled, his eyes carrying the haunted look of someone who'd run out of places to hide. "I'm not here to kill you," Ethan said, though part of him wondered if that was true. "Aren't you?" Callum stepped into the lamplight. "That's what you want, isn't it? To watch me die for what I did, to balance the scales." "I want the truth," Ethan replied. "I want you to stand before this community and tell them what you did. I want you to name the children who died because of your greed. I want you to carry the weight of those deaths instead of hiding behind your collar." Callum laughed, a bitter sound devoid of humor. "The truth. Everyone talks about truth like it's some pure, shining thing. But truth is just another weapon, Marshal. You can use it to heal or to hurt. And right now, you're using it to destroy me. You destroyed yourself the moment you opened that strongbox and chose money over children's lives. It wasn't supposed to happen like that." Callum's composure cracked, his voice rising with desperate passion. "Do you think I planned for children to die? Do you think I'm a monster?" "Then tell me what happened," Ethan said quietly. "Tell me why you stole that money." Callum sank onto one of the pews, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. For a long moment, he stared at his hands as if seeing blood there that wouldn't wash away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was in debt. Gambling debt, mostly. I had a weakness for cards, thought I could beat the odds, kept losing. The men I owed weren't the forgiving type. They threatened to expose me, to ruin my reputation, to burn down the church if I didn't pay. $3,000. That's what I owed." "So you stole it?" "I borrowed it," Callum corrected weakly. "That's what I told myself. I would borrow the orphanage money, pay off the debt, and then raise new funds. The orphans would have their home, just a little later than planned. Nobody would ever know. But you never raised new funds." Callum shook his head. "Once I started lying, it became easier to keep lying. I told the congregation the money was stolen. They believed me because they wanted to believe, because doubting me meant doubting everything they'd built their faith on. And once I saw how easily they accepted the lie, I realized I could get away with it, could use church funds for myself, could live comfortably while preaching sacrifice, could hide my sins behind the pulpit. And the orphans, the children who died, I tried not to think about them, Callum admitted, his voice breaking. I told myself they would have died anyway, that frontier life was hard, that their deaths weren't my fault. But I knew, God help me, I always knew. Every funeral I conducted, every grave I blessed, I knew that some of those children might have lived if the orphanage had been built, and I carried that knowledge like a stone in my chest, getting heavier every year. Ethan felt something shift inside him, not forgiveness, but a recognition of the man beneath the monster. Callum wasn't evil incarnate. He was weak, flawed, human, and somehow that made his crimes worse, because it meant that any man could fall as far if he chose comfort over conscience often enough. "Why are you telling me this now?" Ethan asked. "Because I'm tired," Callum said simply. "Tired of lying, tired of hiding, tired of waking up every morning and remembering what I am. You want your truth, Marshal? Here it is. I stole that money. I let children die to protect my secret. I've spent 20 years wearing the mask of a holy man while rotting from the inside. And if your frontier justice demands I hang for it, maybe that's the mercy I've been too afraid to ask for." The confession hung between them, raw and terrible. Ethan had imagined this moment countless times, the righteous confrontation, the villain brought low, the satisfaction of justice served. But standing here in the darkness, facing a broken man who destroyed himself as thoroughly as he destroyed others, Ethan felt no satisfaction, only a vast, hollow sadness. "I can't give you mercy," Ethan said finally. "That's not my decision to make, but I can give you a choice. Tomorrow, the town will gather again. You can face them. Tell them what you told me. Take responsibility for what you did. It won't erase the past, but it might give those families some measure of peace. And if I refuse, then I'll drag you before them in chains and let them decide your fate. And I don't think their judgment will be gentle." Callum was silent for a long time, wrestling with the choice between a dignity he didn't deserve and a cowardice he'd indulged for too long. Finally, he nodded. "I'll face them. In the morning, I'll tell them everything." Ethan turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. The orphanage you built 10 years later, was any of that real? Did you actually try to make amends?" Callum looked up, and for the first time, something like genuine emotion crossed his face. "That was real. I used church funds, yes, but I also gave my own savings, what little I had left. I told myself it was penance, that maybe if I saved some children, it would balance against the ones I'd failed. But you can't balance that ledger, can you? The dead don't care about the living you save." "No," Ethan agreed. "They don't." He walked out of the church into the cool night air, leaving Callum alone with his confession and his ghosts. Above, stars burned cold and distant, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to justice or mercy or the small tragedies that defined frontier lives. Ethan stood there, looking up at that vast indifference, and wondered if tomorrow would bring closure or just another kind of pain. Behind him, through the church window, he could see Callum still sitting in the pew, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A man of God brought low by his own weakness, waiting for dawn and judgment. Ethan walked back to the hotel, knowing that sleep wouldn't come, knowing that the hardest part was still ahead, because getting Callum to confess was only half the battle. Making a town accept that confession, making them confront their own complicity in protecting him, that would be the real test of whether justice could survive in places where faith and convenience had long since replaced truth. Dawn broke over Salvation Ridge with the kind of crystalline clarity that made every shadow sharp as a knife edge. The town gathered in square before the church, not because anyone had called a meeting, but because word had spread through whispers and urgent knocks on doors. Reverend Callum was going to speak, was going to confess, was going to finally answer for the sins that had haunted Salvation Ridge for 20 years. They came in their Sunday clothes, as if this were a service rather than an execution of reputation. They came with faces set hard against emotion, determined to hear without feeling, to judge without mercy. They came because some truths, once spoken aloud, could never be unspoken, and they needed to witness the moment when their world shifted on its axis. Ethan stood at the church steps, his marshal's badge catching the early light. Beside him, Catherine Morrison held her ledgers like sacred texts, physical proof of crimes committed and documented. Samuel Braddock and Ruth Kinsey stood with the other families who'd lost children, forming a silent line of witnesses whose presence alone was accusation enough. The church doors opened. Reverend Callum emerged, and the crowd gasped collectively. The man who stepped into the sunlight barely resembled the confident preacher who'd stood in this same spot countless times before. He'd aged overnight, his face gray and drawn, his shoulders bowed under invisible weight, his hands trembling as he gripped the railing for support. He wore his ministerial collar, but it looked like a noose around his neck rather than a symbol of authority. "People of Salvation Ridge," Callum began, his voice cracking on the first words. He cleared his throat, tried again. "I stand before you today not as your shepherd, but as a man who has sinned against you, against God, and against the memory of children who deserved better than what I gave them." The crowd stirred, uncertain how to react. They'd come expecting defiance or denial, prepared to rage against continued lies. But this broken, trembling figure offering confession disarmed them, left them struggling between anger and something that might have been pity. 20 years ago," Callum continued, forcing the words out like pulling teeth, "this community came together to build an orphanage. You gave sacrificially, money you could barely afford, money taken from your own children's mouths, because you believed in helping those with no one else to turn to. $3,042. I remember the exact amount because I counted it every night, watching it grow, knowing what it represented. Your faith, your charity, your collective goodness." He paused, gripping the railing tighter, his knuckles white. "And I stole it. Every dollar. Not in one theft, but gradually, over weeks, taking a little at a time, replacing real money with my own IOUs that I never intended to honor. I told myself I was borrowing it, that I'd pay it back, that nobody would ever know. But those were lies I told myself to justify theft." The crowd erupted, shouts of anger, cries of betrayal, voices demanding to know why. How could he? What kind of monster? But Callum raised his hand, and something in his expression, some naked anguish, made them fall silent. "I stole it because I was weak, because I had gambling debts I couldn't pay, because I was afraid of being exposed as less than the holy man you believed me to be. I chose my reputation over your trust, my comfort over children's lives. And when the time came to account for the missing money, I lied again. I blamed drifters who didn't exist, created a fiction that you accepted because you wanted to believe in me more than you wanted to question me." Samuel Braddock stepped forward, his massive frame rigid with barely controlled rage. "And the children? What about the 12 children who died because there was no orphanage to protect them?" Callum's face crumpled, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Their names are carved in my memory like epitaphs. Thomas Fletcher, age 7. Margaret Kinsey, age 9. Rebecca Braddock, age 10. He continued, naming all 12, his voice breaking on each one. "They died because I failed them, because the building that should have sheltered them was never built, because I valued money over lives." "My Rebecca," Braddock said, his voice thick with emotion, "died in a dirt shack, coughing blood, alone except for rats. And you stood at her funeral and talked about God's mysterious plans. You spoke words of comfort while knowing you were the reason she was dead." "Yes," Callum whispered. "Yes, I did. And I've carried that weight every day since, knowing I was responsible, knowing I was too much a coward to confess, choosing to live with guilt rather than face consequences. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm not asking for mercy. I've shown none to those I harmed. I'm simply telling you the truth that I should have spoken 20 years ago. I am a thief, a liar, and by my weakness and greed, I have blood on my hands." The silence that followed was absolute, profound, The kind of silence that falls when something fundamental breaks and can never be repaired. Catherine Morrison stepped forward, her voice cutting clear through the stillness. I have documentation of everything he's confessed. Bank records showing where the money went. Church ledgers proving no personal funds were used for the later orphanage. Every word he's spoken is verifiable truth. So what happens now? Ruth Kinsey asked, looking not at Callum, but at Ethan. What's the law say we do with a man who steals from God and lets children die? Ethan had been dreading this moment, the point where his oath as a marshal collided with his understanding of frontier justice. By territorial law, he can be charged with theft and fraud. Those are serious crimes, but the statute of limitations has likely expired for the original theft. The deaths of the children, legally, those would be harder to prosecute, because proving direct causation in a court would be difficult. So he gets away with it? Braddock's voice rose dangerously. After everything, after confessing in front of all of us, he just walks away. I didn't say that, Ethan replied carefully. I said what the law allows. But you all heard his confession. You all know what he did. The question isn't what I can do as a marshal. It's what you, as a community, choose to do with that knowledge. The crowd began to murmur, voices rising in debate. Some called for immediate hanging, for frontier justice delivered swift and final. Others advocated for formal charges, for letting territorial courts decide even if the outcome was uncertain. A few, surprising Ethan, spoke quietly about mercy, about how Callum's suffering was evident, about whether killing a broken man served any purpose beyond revenge. Martha Henley, the boarding house owner who'd once fed young Ethan bread, stepped forward. She was in her 70s now, bent with age but sharp-eyed and clear-voiced. I've lived in this town 50 years, she said, commanding attention through sheer presence. I've seen hangings and shootings and all manner of violence men do to each other in the name of justice. And I'll tell you what I've learned. Killing doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't heal grief. It just adds more graves to the cemetery and more guilt for the living to carry. So we do nothing. Ruth Kinsey challenged. We let him continue living here, preaching, pretending. No, Martha replied. We strip him of the position he abused. We take his collar, his pulpit, his authority. We make him leave Salvation Ridge and never return. We ensure that every town within 100 miles knows what he did, so he can never victimize another community. We take everything he valued, his reputation, his standing, his comfort, and we leave him alive to live with the consequences. That's justice that lasts longer than a rope. The crowd considered this, the appeal of a punishment that didn't require them to become executioners. Ethan watched the calculation happening in their faces, weighing vengeance against conscience, anger against practicality, the desire for blood against the cost of spilling it. Finally, Samuel Braddock spoke, and his words carried weight, because everyone knew he had the most right to demand death. My daughter is gone. Nothing we do here will bring her back. But Martha's right. I don't want more death. I want him to live knowing what he is, knowing that every person he meets will see him as the man who stole from orphans and let them die. I want him to carry Rebecca's name and the names of the other 11 children like stones around his neck for whatever years he has left. One by one, the other families nodded agreement. Not forgiveness, nothing approaching forgiveness, but collective decision that exile and exposure were punishment enough. Callum stood through all of it, silent, accepting whatever judgment they delivered. Then it's decided, Ethan said formally. Nathaniel Callum, you are stripped of your position as minister of this church. You have 24 hours to gather your personal belongings and leave Salvation Ridge. If you ever return, you will face charges of trespassing and likely worse. I will personally ensure that every marshal, every sheriff, every town council within the territory knows what you did here. Your reputation, such as it was, is finished. Callum nodded slowly, seeming almost relieved that the waiting was over, that the secret he'd carried for 2 decades was finally exposed to light and air. Thank you, he said quietly, addressing not Ethan but the crowd. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak truth, even though I waited far too long to do so. I will leave tomorrow, and I will carry the names of those 12 children with me wherever I go. It's less than they deserved, but it's all I have left to give." He turned and walked back into the church, no longer their reverend, no longer clothed in authority, just an old man facing the remainder of his years alone with his ghosts. The crowd began to disperse slowly, speaking in hushed tones, processing what they'd witnessed and what it meant for their town, their faith, their understanding of the men they trusted to lead them. Ethan remained on the steps, watching them go, feeling not triumph, but exhaustion. Justice had been served, after a fashion, not the clean, satisfying justice of legal sentences and formal punishments, but the messier, more human version, where consequences were measured in shame and exile rather than blood. Catherine Morrison approached, her ledgers tucked under her arm. "Do you think it was enough?" she asked. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but it's what they chose, and that matters. They had the power to kill him, and they chose something else. Maybe that's progress. Or maybe," Catherine said quietly, "we're just too civilized to do what needs doing, and too uncivilized to truly forgive. We exist in the middle, trying to be better than we are." Ethan had no answer for that. He simply stood there as the sun climbed higher, watching Salvation Ridge return to its routines, forever changed by truths that couldn't be unspoken, by choices that would define them for years to come. 24 hours later, Ethan stood at the edge of town, watching Reverend Nathaniel Callum, no longer Reverend, just Nathaniel now, load his few remaining possessions onto a wagon. The old man moved slowly, deliberately, like someone performing a ritual rather than a task. Everything he'd accumulated over 40 years of ministry had been reduced to 2 trunks and a bedroll. The town had ensured his departure wouldn't be comfortable. They'd taken back the house that came with his position, reclaimed the furnishings bought with church funds, even removed the books from his personal library that had been donated by parishioners over the years. What remained were the bare essentials of survival and nothing more, a deliberate stripping away of the comfort he'd stolen from orphans 2 decades ago. "Where will you go?" Ethan asked, not from concern but from professional thoroughness. He wanted to know where this man would surface next, wanted to ensure he kept his promise to warn other communities. "West," Callum replied, cinching a rope around one of the trunks. "California, maybe. Somewhere I'm not known, where I can work with my hands instead of my words. I've spent 40 years talking about God's grace while showing none myself. Perhaps physical labor will teach me what sermons couldn't." "You could have fought the exile," Ethan observed. "Could have argued that confession should earn leniency, that your cooperation deserved consideration." Callum paused in his work, looking at Ethan with eyes that held something that might have been wisdom earned too late. "To what end? To stay in a town that rightly despises me? To continue wearing a collar I've desecrated beyond redemption? No, Marshal. This exile is mercy I don't deserve. They could have killed me, probably should have, and instead they're giving me years I haven't earned to try becoming something other than what I am." "And what are you?" Ethan asked, curious despite himself. "A cautionary tale," Callum said simply. "A reminder that righteousness is a mask anyone can wear, but character is what remains when the mask comes off. I wore the mask so long I forgot there was supposed to be something beneath it." He finished securing his belongings and climbed onto the wagon seat with the stiff movements of age and regret. "Will you do something for me, Marshal?" "Depends what it is. Visit the cemetery before you leave town. Find the graves of those 12 children. Tell them." His voice broke, and he had to pause, collect himself. "Tell them that someone finally spoke their names aloud and acknowledged what was done to them. Tell them it's insufficient and it comes too late, but it's the only truth I can offer." "Tell them yourself," Ethan said coldly. "You're the one who needs their forgiveness, not me." "I already did," Callum replied quietly. "Spent last night at the cemetery, standing at each grave, speaking each name, asking forgiveness I know I'll never receive. But hearing it from someone who actually cared about them, someone who survived when they didn't, that might mean something. Or maybe I'm still just a selfish man looking for absolution where none exists. He flicked the reins, and the wagon began to roll forward, wheels crunching on the packed dirt road that would carry him away from Salvation Ridge forever. Ethan watched until the wagon was a speck on the horizon, a diminishing point of darkness against the vast emptiness of the western landscape. Catherine Morrison materialized beside him, appearing so quietly he hadn't heard her approach. "Do you feel satisfied?" she asked. "No," Ethan admitted. "I feel like we settled for less than justice because real justice was too complicated, too expensive, too uncertain. We took the easy path and called it mercy." "Maybe that's what mercy is," Catherine suggested. "The easy path we take when the hard path requires more brutality than we can stomach. We're not savages, Marshal, no matter how much the frontier tries to make us into them. We chose exile over execution because we're trying to be civilized, even if civilization seems like a thin veneer barely covering our violent impulses." Ethan considered that, watching the empty road. The 12 children who died, they don't care about our attempts at civilization. They're dead whether we hanged Callum or exiled him. "True," Catherine agreed, "but we're not doing this for the dead. We're doing it for the living, for ourselves, for the kind of community we want to be. Every choice shapes us, Marshal. We chose not to be the kind of town that lynches old men, even guilty ones. That has to mean something." "Does it mean enough?" Catherine had no answer for that, and they stood together in silence, two people wrestling with the gap between the justice they'd imagined and the compromise they'd accepted. Finally, she spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "What will you do now? Your mission here is complete." Ethan touched the badge on his chest, feeling its weight, considering its meaning. "I'll do what Callum asked. Visit the cemetery, speak their names. Then I'll move on to the next town, the next crime, the next attempt to impose order on chaos. It's what I do." "That sounds lonely." "It is," Ethan agreed, "but it's also necessary. Someone has to stand between the people who pray and the people who are preyed upon. Someone has to care about old crimes and forgotten victims. If I don't, who will?" He left Catherine standing at the town's edge and walked to the cemetery on the low hill east of Salvation Ridge. The graveyard was small, orderly, filled with wooden crosses and stone markers that cataloged the brutal arithmetic of frontier life. Children who died young, mothers who died in childbirth, men who died from violence or disease or simple exhaustion. He found the 12 graves without difficulty. They were grouped together, as if the town had unconsciously acknowledged their shared tragedy, even while refusing to examine its cause. Someone, probably Callum, during his nighttime vigil, had placed wildflowers on each grave, small purple blooms already wilting in the harsh sun. Ethan stood before the first marker. Thomas Fletcher, age 7, 1872 to 1874. A child who'd lived just 7 years, whose potential had been crushed by falling from a barn roof because he'd been forced into labor too dangerous for his age. "Thomas Fletcher," Ethan said aloud, his voice carrying across the silent cemetery. "You deserved better. You deserved a home that protected you, adults who valued your life, a chance to grow up and become whoever you might have been. What happened to you wasn't God's will or bad luck or inevitable tragedy. It was theft and greed and cowardice, and someone finally acknowledged that." He moved to the next grave, and the next, speaking each name, telling each child the same truth. They mattered. They were wronged. Someone had finally been held accountable. It felt insufficient. Words over graves, truth spoken 20 years too late. But it was all he could offer. When he reached the last grave, Rebecca Braddock, age 10, 1872 to 1882, he found Samuel Braddock already there, kneeling in the dirt, his massive hands gentle as he arranged fresh flowers around his daughter's marker. "She liked yellow flowers," Braddock said without looking up. "Buttercups, specifically. Used to pick them by the dozen when she was small, bring them to her mother with dirt still on the roots and the biggest smile you ever saw." His voice was steady, but tears streaked his face. "I come here every week, talk to her, tell her about the forge, about the town, about ordinary things, because I don't know what else to do with all this love that has nowhere to go." Ethan knelt beside him, two men sharing grief at the grave of a child who deserved so much more than she'd received. "She mattered," Ethan said. "Her life, however short, mattered. And what was done to her, what was stolen from her, has been acknowledged. It doesn't bring her back, but it means her death wasn't meaningless." "Wasn't it, though?" Braddock asked quietly. "She died alone in a shack, surrounded by strangers who didn't love her, suffering from an illness that could have been treated if anyone had cared enough. And the man responsible gets to ride away into the sunset, old and broken but alive. How is that meaning? How is that justice?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "Maybe it isn't. Maybe all we did was make ourselves feel better about failing her 20 years ago. But the alternative was becoming the kind of people who hang old men in the street, and maybe, refusing to do that means something too." Braddock was quiet for a long moment, his hands still arranging flowers with infinite care. "I wanted him dead," he finally confessed. "Stood in that crowd yesterday with murder in my heart, ready to tie the noose myself. But then I thought about Rebecca, about the girl she was, kind, gentle, always trying to see the best in people even when they didn't deserve it. And I thought, if she could see me now, would she want her father to be a killer? Would she want her death to create more death?" "What did you decide?" "That I didn't know," Braddock said. "That I'd never know. That I was making the choice I could live with, not the choice I was certain was right. Maybe that's all any of us can do. Muddle through with imperfect choices and hope we're doing more good than harm." They stayed there together as the sun climbed higher, two men paying respects to a child stolen by greed and negligence, trying to find meaning in tragedy that resisted all attempts at meaning. Eventually, Braddock stood, brushing dirt from his knees, and extended a hand to help Ethan up. "What will you do now, Marshal?" Braddock asked. "Move on," Ethan replied. "There are other towns, other crimes, other people waiting for someone to care about justice. What about you?" "Stay here," Braddock said, looking back at his daughter's grave. "Keep the forge running. Keep visiting Rebecca. Keep trying to be the man she believed I was. It's not redemption. I don't deserve that, but it's something. A purpose. A reason to keep going." They walked back toward town together, leaving the cemetery behind, carrying their grief and their choices like weights they'd never be able to set down. Salvation Ridge spread before them, a small collection of buildings and hopes and compromises, a town trying to be better than its worst moments, to find grace in the gap between the justice they'd wanted and the mercy they'd chosen. Ethan collected his horse from the livery stable that afternoon, settling his bill and preparing for departure. As he led his mount into the street, he found half the town gathered to see him off. Not a formal farewell, but a spontaneous acknowledgement that something significant had passed through Salvation Ridge and left them changed. Catherine Morrison approached, pressing a small package wrapped in brown paper into his hands. "Letters," she explained, "from the families of the 12. They wanted you to have something, testimony, I suppose, about who those children were before they died. So they'd be more than names on graves or entries in a ledger. So they'd be remembered as people who lived, not just victims who died." Ethan took the package, feeling its weight, not physical but moral, a burden and a gift simultaneously. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. "I'll carry these with me. Add them to the others I've collected from other towns, other crimes. Evidence that people mattered, that their lives counted for something beyond the violence that ended them." "That's a heavy load to carry," Catherine observed. "It is," Ethan agreed, mounting his horse. "But someone has to carry it. Someone has to remember." He rode out of Salvation Ridge as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, the colors of endings and new beginnings. Behind him, the town returned to its rhythms, the blacksmith's hammer, the general store's commerce, the daily business of survival on the frontier. They would rebuild their church with a new minister, would tell stories about the marshal who came seeking justice and found something more complicated, would wrestle for years with the question of whether they had chosen mercy or merely cowardice. But Ethan wouldn't be there to see it. He had other towns to visit, other forgotten victims to remember, other attempts to impose justice on a world that seemed determined to resist it. The badge on his chest caught the fading sunlight, a small point of reflection in the gathering darkness, and he rode west toward whatever waited beyond the next horizon. Behind him, in the cemetery on the hill, 12 graves held 12 children who deserved better. And now, finally, after 20 years of silence, their names had been spoken aloud, their deaths acknowledged, their lives given the dignity of truth. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. A small victory against the darkness, a tiny assertion that justice, however delayed and imperfect, still mattered in a world that often seemed to value nothing but power and profit. Ethan rode on, carrying their names with him, adding them to the collection of ghosts that traveled at his shoulder wherever he went. The weight of those names, those stories, those unfinished accountings, that was the price of being a man who still believed justice was possible, even when evidence suggested otherwise. It was a heavy price, but Ethan had learned long ago that the alternative, surrendering to cynicism, accepting that might made right, allowing the powerful to prey on the weak without consequence, was heavier still. So he rode west toward the setting sun, toward whatever came next, carrying salvation and damnation in equal measure, hoping that somewhere in the balance between the two, justice might still find room to breathe. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.